there is this quest to share appropriate knowledge, not the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, but rather appropriate knowledge through this storytelling, for example. And of course, day 3 is important because this is, as we know, at line 699, the day of resurrection, Matthew 16:21, and any number of other places. We'll see this, of course, with references in Paradise Regained, the text that we'll study next. At line 704, we've mentioned it, and then again at 716, there let them learn, as likes them, to despise God and Messiah, his anointed king. In other words, in some ways this is an exercise for God, as Milton describes it, where God is going to be the great teacher. And the way he's going to do it is, of course, through the Son, who is going to lead the armies in conquest and the like, right? By the way, thinking about this, there seems to be some suggestion that the only way Satan and his crew is going to learn is through pain and, of course, fear. That, let's put it in our notes, immediately makes us think about Plato's Republic, book 7, as we have taught it in another lecture, that Plato's pedagogy, or his understanding of education, is that always it's going to involve, all learning involves some elements of fear and pain, and certainly God is going to use some of that. Well, we start at line 748 to begin day 3, Jack Day. That is to say, Satan is about to get his. And at line 801, the Son will say it, stand still in bright array, ye saints. Here stand ye angels armed. In other words, there is nothing for us to fear. Everything is taken care of. However, at line 855, yet half his strength he put not forth, but checked his thunder in mid-volley, for he meant not to destroy Satan and the rest of the angels, but to root them out of heaven. The overthrown he raised, and as a herd of goats or trimmers flocked together, thronged, drove them before him, thunderstruck for the AC/DC fans in the house, pursued with terrors and with fears to the bounds and crystal wall of heaven. In other words, he drives them to the crystal wall of heaven, which, opening wide, rowled inward. Rowled is a word Milton loves. If you've read much of Paradise Lost, you'll see the word over and over. And a spacious gap disclosed into the wasteful deep. On the other side of heaven, there is the deep, the abyss, chaos, hell. The monstrous sight struck them with horror backward, but far worse urged them behind. Headlong themselves they threw. Line 864, it's an important moment. They threw down from the verge of heaven. Eternal wrath burn after them to the bottomless pit. In other words, let's put it in our notes. For Milton, the angels that ultimately are fallen choose to jump out of heaven. They're not actually thrown, although early in the poem that suggestion is made by Satan. They actually choose to leap, to go. Again, you are as free as you allow yourself to be. This is part of Milton's theodicy. In the same way that he will make this argument that humankind choose, through Adam and Eve, choose to fall, so does Satan and his group. For 9 days, line 871, they fall, and then ultimately they land, of course, on the lake of fire. Now, we should point this out, and we'll say this again here in a second. This moment, when they land on the lake of fire, is where we start the poem at the very beginning in Book 1. This is what we mean by in medias res, in the middle of the action. Okay? So when we pick up Paradise Lost after the invocation, there we are. Of course, we don't know why is Satan and his crew laying on this burning fire, this lake, this lake of burning fire. Like, why? Like, what is it that led them there? Now in Book 6, halfway through the poem, we finally find out. Well, how does all of this end? Starting at line 893, because I love this language so much, let's go ahead and read it. Thus, measuring things in heaven, Raphael now is at the end of his story, and he's talking to Adam. Thus, measuring things in heaven by things on earth at thy request, and that thou mayest beware by what is past to thee, I have revealed what might have else to human race been hid. The discord which befell and war in heaven among the angelic powers, and the deep fall of those too high aspiring who rebelled with Satan. He who envies now thy state, who now is plotting how he may seduce thee also from obedience, that with him, bereaved of happiness, thou mayest partake his punishment, eternal misery, which would be all his solace and revenge as a despite done against the Most High. Thee wants to gain companion of his, you knew this word was coming, woe, go back to the invocation in book 1. But listen not to his temptations. Warn thy weaker. We're talking here in patriarchal language, obviously Eve. Let it profit thee to have heard by terrible example the reward of disobedience. Firm they might have stood. He's talking obviously about Satan. Yet fell. And of course, we can hear Milton's voice here saying, they might have stood, as in Adam and Eve, but fell. Remember and fear to transgress. Well, of course, some powerful, powerful words at the very end of the story. Let's just make sure we understand that this is the attempt by Milton to justify the ways of God to man. But of course, it is the attempt by Raphael to say to Adam, listen to the events of the past. We think of Santayana's famous line, those who forget the past are damned to repeat it. Of course, this idea that if you want to have any sense of the future, you have to study the past and what has happened in the past. This is the point of the story. And of course, now as we turn to 2a, this is the point of all epic, isn't it? It is to some degree always a kind of propedeutic. We've said before in other lectures that all epics are kind of like national songs. They tell us things that we're supposed to care about. Certainly the culture that produced those epics. At 2a, let's just do some quick themes and messages now as we finish up our conversation about Book 6. The clash of great armies. Of course, war is hell, a major theme. That is to say, it shouldn't be celebrated, but when it has to happen, war often is the way in which great and heroic deeds are done. Of course, the danger of weapons. We immediately think of the notion from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that technology can be devastating. We, of course, think about the power splitting the atom and the ways in which the Second World War ends with that atomic weapon, those two, on the two cities of Japan. And yet immediately a Cold War ensues. Of course, the notion of learning from a story and the identification with a story takes us back to, for example, texts like Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a text that we say at the very end of that text, we say, notice how there is this identification with the text, so much so that the young man, once he hears the story about Jack the Bird shooting at the albatross, he doesn't want to go to the party anymore. He goes home and he wakes up the next morning sadder and wiser. We'll see if Adam wakes up sadder and wiser. Certainly, Adam will be sadder and wiser later in our poem, by book 9 for sure. Let's talk level 2b, rhetoric. Not what the poet says, but how the poet says it. For example, we can study these battle scenes, and we can see how he is borrowing heavily from battle scenes from Homer, from Virgil, of course, to some degree as well from certain battles in the Bible that are translated. Number 2, notice that the tension is maybe missing because of the nature of the dynamics of what's going on. I mean, we understand how this story is going to end. And yet, Milton is trying to create a level of tension, right? Although nobody dies, nobody can die. Of course, we have to talk about the irony here, right? They choose to jump out of heaven into hell instead of just turn around, fall on their knees, and beg for forgiveness. And then, of course, after 9 days, as we said, that's where book 1 actually begins. So you got to read from book 1 all the way to book 6 before you finally fully understand what is going on in terms of this fall out of heaven and the beginning of Paradise Lost. It's a genius way for Milton to begin his epic because it kind of looks like maybe Satan is going to be his hero, his protagonist, and yet by book 6 we understand there isn't anything really that Milton is going to say is heroic about Satan. Milton will show us other heroes like Abdiel, of course, and the quintessential hero obviously is the sun. Okay, let's jump to level 3. How do we relate to a text like this? I mean, obviously there's a lot of ways we can talk about this. For example, great movies that portray war. We immediately think of those first 20 minutes of Steve Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. There's other films that you could probably write down in your notes, and of course video games that demonstrate the horrors of war. They don't celebrate it, they demonstrate the horrors of war. The great novels that are in this vein, we obviously have already mentioned All Quiet on the Western Front, Red Badge of Courage comes to mind. You can write down the other ones that for you work. Of course, think about the texts that we know of as warning texts. One that immediately comes to mind because we just recently studied it, right, is Orwell's 1984. Orwell, in many ways, was trying to somehow suggest to an audience of his own time and then to come, we got to be careful with what happens when technology begins to take away the independence, the freedom, the identity of citizens. Finally, at 3B, you can't help but read a book like Book 5 and 6 together, and kind of put yourself in Adam's situation of listening to the story, and then, of course, try to relate to the self. Let's ask a few questions. Do you find this an exciting book or kind of a boring book? Because there doesn't seem to be the psychological tension that we've experienced in books 1 through 4, especially. Of course, the theodictic question is central. Why let Satan live? Why not just destroy him, and then his angels that are kind of behind him, give them the choice to either live a repentant life or to die? And Milton has no interest in it. Of course, again, it's all setting up. Everything is building towards Book 9. And of course, the story that we read earlier in another lecture from the King James Bible, Genesis chapter 3. Because we all know how this is ultimately going to end up, right? Of course, Abiel's courage to stand up face to face and fight Satan. Do you see that as heroic? And if so, why do you see that as heroic? And immediately we think, of course, of Beowulf's decision to come unsolicited from the land of the Geats to the land of the Danes to say, would you let me fight against this monster Grendel? Potentially risk his life, but he wants to prove something. Finally, of course, the question, do you, when you study yourself, have a tendency to listen to the advice that's given to you of old-timers or whatever? Or do you have a tendency to say, I figure stuff out on my own, thanks very much, I don't need somebody telling me about what it is I should or should not do? Let's now turn to Book 7, shall we? As we begin to prepare for the inevitable fall of Book 9 and the development of characterization. I want you to put that in your notes at 2B, because that's the game that Milton will begin to play now as we get on into Book 7, Book 8, and of course, Book 9 and the fall. Thank you very much for joining me.